Hello, good morning, good day or good evening, depending on where you are. Hello to all the participants and the audience of our today's event. We're starting our discussion about Chernobyl, which is tied to today's sad anniversary, the 35th anniversary of the worst nuclear disaster in the history of humankind. And we take this opportunity to discuss the long-lasting consequences of this tragedy and to think of various lessons that Ukraine and the international community has learned or will have to learn from this tragedy, and also to reflect on various long-lasting consequences across different areas, across different disciplines, and of course in the scholarly field brought along by this terrible disaster. My name is Volodymyr Sheiko. I am Director General of the Ukrainian Institute, which is Ukraine's cultural diplomacy organization that is affiliated to the Foreign Ministry of Ukraine. And today with us, we have three very distinguished guests and speakers. Ambassador Sergiy Kyslytsya, permanent representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, and two distinguished historians and experts and leading specialists in the themes that are linked to our today's discussion. Professor Serhii Plokhii, who is director of the Ukrainian Studies Institute at Harvard University, and leading specialist in the history of Eastern Europe and a member of the Ukrainian PAN. Serhii has written a lot about history of Ukraine and history of Eastern Europe and worked a lot with classified materials in the times of USSR. And Serhii is the author of the book Chernobyl, The History of the Nuclear Catastrophe, in which Serhii analyzed the geopolitical situation and the factors that led to the Chernobyl disaster, as well as its impact on civilization. And we also have Professor Olga Bertelsen, who teaches at the Department of Intelligence and International Relations at Embry-Riddle College of Security and Intelligence at Prescott, Arizona. Olga's scientific interests include the military and diplomatic history of Russia, Ukraine, and the United States and Eastern Europe, authoritarian regimes and human behavior under authoritarianism, chemical weapons programs, Soviet and Russian intelligence service, and disinformation. I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Sergiy Kyslytsya for his welcome words, and then we'll proceed to short keynote presentations from our speakers, followed by discussion and, of course, Q&A.
Well, thank you, Volodymyr. Distinguished participants, dear friends, thank you for your participation in today's event. Chernobyl accident taught the international community an important lesson and made us think deeper about the risks of nuclear energy. The world had never before suffered a human-caused catastrophe of such a magnitude. It has changed the lives of generations and has had a long-term impact on the environment. Overcoming the impact of the Chernobyl catastrophe has become a remarkable example of international solidarity. We are grateful to the international community and our partners for not leaving my country alone in the face of a terrible enemy, radiation. It is critical to keep the issue of post-Chernobyl recovery high on the international agenda to guarantee sustained recovery and development of affected districts, mitigating the long-term social, economic, and environmental effects of the Chernobyl catastrophe. Dear colleagues, along with a history of courage and global unity, Chernobyl has been a history of disinformation attempts. We believe that against the backdrop of today's challenges in the information domain, it is a powerful reminder that disinformation, just like radiation, is an invisible killer. Today we can talk about exactly what happened after the accident, how the Soviet authorities desperately tried to hide the truth from their own people and other countries. I would like to express my gratitude to our speakers, Serhii Plokhii and Olga Bertelsen, for their willingness to participate in this event. We believe that today's discussion will demonstrate in concrete historical facts how dangerous disinformation can be and how important it is for the international community to ensure that such events are counteracted, not to be repeated. And I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I would like to give floor to our speakers. And indeed, I think, well, Chernobyl disaster is an example of so many wrongdoings of the humankind, the governance systems of the Soviet Union, disinformation, and of course the environmental impact of Chernobyl still is a lasting legacy and lasting impact that we're dealing with today. But I think what I would like to cover in this discussion today is the less evident and less obvious aftermath or lasting consequences of this tragedy, and I'm sure that the speakers will cover that in their respective presentations. But I would like to start with Serhii and his brief keynote presentation. Serhii, the theme of your keynote presentation is nuclear energy and the arrogance of man, revisiting the Chernobyl nuclear disaster 35 years later. Over to you, Serhii, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this panel. It's a real pleasure. My presentation is limited to 15 minutes, but I will try also to show some of the images that I have, and in that way, maybe that will help to structure also my presentation. I will talk about the causes of Chernobyl accident and consequences of the Chernobyl accident that are certainly rooted into the realities of the 1960s, realities of the Soviet Union of that period, the Cold War competition between the superpowers, but also the causes and consequences that, in my opinion, go beyond the time and place when the accident took place and have a broader international context and broader international significance. And one of those is basically the military origins of the nuclear energy anywhere in the world, whether it was the Soviet Union, whether the United States or any other country. The nuclear energy was really an afterthought when it comes to the investment, when it comes to the focus, when it comes to the attention the politicians were paying in the 40s, in the 50s, 60s, and until later on to the development of atoms for peace versus atoms for war. So all the attention, all the investment went, or most of it went into the atoms for war. And the reactors that we have are in one way or another all over the world today, all different models. They're one way or another rooted into the history of the war effort. And nowhere that was probably more true than in case of the Soviet Union, because the people who delivered to the world the first Soviet nuclear bomb and hydrogen bomb, and you can see those gentlemen over there, the head of the Soviet Academy of Sciences at that time, Anatoly Alexandrov, and the director of what was the equivalent of the Soviet Manhattan Project, the Ministry of the Medium Machine Building, Mr. Efim Slavsky. So they were the key figures in the construction of the Soviet atomic bomb and the reactors that produced weapon-grade uranium and plutonium. And also they were the one of the key actors, one of the key authors in the design of the RBMK, the reactor Большой мощности канальный, the reactor that was used in Chernobyl and the reactor that exploded. The reactor was of dual purpose. That means that it was really a reconstruction of the reactor used for the production of uranium And if there was a necessity, it could be also used to stop the production of electricity and start the production of weapon grades uranium. What that meant was that it was cheaper to build it. The idea was that those reactors would be functioning maybe for 10, 15 years to fill the gap before the Soviet Union would be able to build new reactors. And that reactor that everyone knew, when I say everyone, I mean the designers, that it had its problems. It exploded. The military origins of the nuclear energy in general and the nuclear origins of the nuclear energy in the Soviet Union meant also one more important thing, and that meant secrecy. So the problems with the reactor, that was something that was kept secret, also from the people whose responsibility was to run those reactors, to operate them. So in 1975, an accident, when it comes to its technical characteristics, which was very close to the one that happened at Chernobyl later, took place or had taken place at the nuclear power plant in Sosnovy Bor, near then the city of Leningrad and now the city of St. Petersburg. But what happened there? The problems that came to the fore as the result of that accident were never really shared with the rest of the industry. And people in the operating room of reactor number 4 on April night of April 26, 1986, they knew nothing about potential problems of the reactor, that he could become unstable when run at a certain level of capacity, a certain power level. So again, that is an important part of the story of the secrecy associated with the military nuclear project. And when one of the people who probably is now best known to anyone who is interested in Chernobyl, Valery Legasov, known because including the mini-series that were released 2 years ago, when he went to Vienna and started to talk about the reactor and what was considered to be secret, he was actually ostracized by his own colleagues. He was ostracized by the entire Soviet industry, which was one of the contributing factors to his death later. Another issue that, apart from the origins of the military origins of the nuclear energy, that I want to talk about is the issue of safety, and a particular culture of safety. In the Soviet Union and in case of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, it had some issues that were related specifically to the Soviet circumstances, but had also broader significance, and the significance that actually is important even today, irrespective of whether we are talking about the RBMK reactor, whether we're talking about Ukraine, Belarus, Soviet Union, or any other country. And this is especially important for the countries that are just entering the nuclear club. So the gentleman whom you see now in this image, the director of the nuclear plant, it's Viktor Bryukhanov. In the center, there is the deputy chief engineer, Anatoly Dyatlov, who was run the test on that fateful night in April of 1986. And then the third is the chief engineer, or was the chief engineer. His last name was Fomin. Well, the problem is, or one of the problems is, that only one of those people was trained as a nuclear engineer. So those were all the first generation nuclear engineers and operators with very little experience, very little training. And the training that they were getting, like Mr. Dyatlov, was actually the training that was received running small reactors at the Soviet submarines. So, which comes with a lot of problems. That was one of the problems in terms of the training, that also was a contributing factor to the 3 Mile Island experiment, 3 Mile Island accident in the late 1970s in the United States at that time. This again, we are talking about the military origins of the program and of the training programs of those people, but also about the lack of the experience and lack of the safety culture, because one that was common for Chernobyl and is true for most of the reactors that are on today is that the main task of those people was, of course, the production of electricity. So they had targets, and the most important thing that they had to do was to meet those targets. So the issues of safety were coming second, and that was a major contributing factor to the disaster. And finally, the third point that I wanted to make in relation to the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. This is the point about the information of the society about the nuclear energy itself, and in particular about the accidents. No company in the world running nuclear reactors, or no government of any country on which territory is located a nuclear plant today, and there are altogether approximately 140 of them in the world today. So none of those players are eager to tell too much to the population at large about nuclear energy, and especially when it comes to the accidents. But the Soviet Union really outdid anybody else, given the complete control over the information that the Communist Party at that time, the central government, had. And the result of that attempt to hide truth about Chernobyl led to the mass mobilization in Ukraine, but also in other former republics of the Soviet Union, once that became possible. Once Gorbachev started the policies of glasnost and perestroika, it was 2 or 3 years after the accident. And what we got as a result was a mass anti-nuclear mobilization in Ukraine in particular, in Lithuania, in other countries. That mass mobilization became a foundation for pro-independence movement in a number of countries, in particular in Ukraine, which raises also a number of important questions, not only about the informational regimes, about management and mismanagement of information, but also about the story of the regimes that benefit from the construction of the nuclear power plants and from the energy that is produced there, but really can be very unstable. And like it was the case with the Soviet Union, actually didn't survive the accident per se when we look at the accident from the historical perspective. And at the end of the day, it was the countries of Ukraine, Belarus, partially Russia, but mostly in terms of the financial contribution, neighbors and international community at large, that picked up the bill for a number of projects associated with Chernobyl, and in particular, the recently constructed new shelter, which the price of that project was above $2 billion. Of course, we are extremely in Ukraine grateful for that help and assistance. But again, this is one of the issues that I want to put forward for the discussion in terms of the national versus international responsibility and liability for the accidents like the one that happened in Chernobyl. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Serhii. I think your statement about sort of the public ignorance of the nature of nuclear energy and possibly the lack of understanding how power plants function and what health and safety concerns might be around that, and of course ignorance about what actions should be taken in a case of a nuclear accident, sort of lead us nicely to the keynote presentation of Olga, and the title of her presentation is "The Influence of Disinformation in the Context of the Chernobyl Tragedy." Olga, please, the floor is yours, and you, I suppose, would speak about about actually the nature of that ignorance and the reasons why the information was, of course, concealed, mismanaged, and which led to even more casualties, deaths, and extreme health implications for those who were liquidators of the tragedy. In the context of today, particularly of today's world and today's disinformation attacks and campaigns that we are witnessing or experiencing, indeed, in our own respective communities, I think that would be a great opportunity to bring these two themes together and link them using this opportunity and today's anniversary. So please, Olga, over to you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and for this opportunity to share with you my thoughts and research on Soviet disinformation pertaining to the tragedy of Chernobyl. Of course, today, it's no longer a secret that in their desperation to save face, the Soviet authorities were willing to sacrifice any number of people, covering up the extent of the tragedy and the number of victims dying from radiation. And the information about Chernobyl was instantly classified, as we know, and that's what I'm going to discuss today. It was nothing new, by the way. From its inception, the Soviet Union engaged in, I would say, colossal deception operations that in the 1950s became known as active measures, активные мероприятия, if we want to use the Kgb term. And disinformation operations were actually a common tactic designed to conceal or obscure the truth about the failures of the Soviet system. And by the way, the Chernobyl accident was not the first nuclear disaster in the Soviet Union. In 1966, for instance, a serious accident occurred aboard the very famous icebreaker Lenin. And this was the first known reactor meltdown at sea. And similar accidents occurred with the same ship in 1982 and later. And from 1981, and it was just consistent actually with the submarine in the Black Sea. Also, there was a meltdown. So information about all these cases was classified. And the KGB designed active measures to conceal the accidents. In the Chernobyl case, these disinformation operations became absolutely crucial, from my perspective, to the regime's survival. And first, I would like to briefly discuss the difference between propaganda and covert action or covert operations, because there is a significant difference, and these terms are being used interchangeably, and we have to understand this difference from my perspective. In contrast to propaganda, where the message and its intent are typically transparent for targeted audiences, disinformation operations keep the intent of altering the reality is camouflaged. To be effective, these operations must be covert, secret, and their target must remain oblivious to their intent. So disinformation includes, as we all know, the spread of false or incomplete or misleading data passed on to groups or individuals in a manner calculated to inspire full confidence in the message carried. And disinformation messages always contain elements of falsehood, so-called deceptive portions that seem very credible and believable to targeted audiences due to the efforts of specially trained people, disinformers, professionals who, by using certain techniques, are able to build sort of a climate of trust and confidence. So importantly, disinformation inflicts harm, and we should remember about this, harm on the target whose action or inaction becomes self-destructive because the target's perceptions of reality had been distorted by these false messages. So how do we know today about the essence and the extent of these operations in 1986 and later, actually? I believe three sources were particularly important. First, it's of course archival documents located in the Sectoral Archive of Security Service in Ukraine. They were, by the way, partially published by the archive for the former Kgb archive and Oleg Bazhan and his team in Kiev in 2019 and 2020. Beautiful two volumes. Anthologies of documents, and also documents that are located in the former party archive in Kiev. But we shouldn't forget about CIA documents on the other side of the ocean, and that were declassified in 2011 and 2012. And they have become available to researchers through the online CIA archive. And finally, of course, the scholarship on the topic. That was just very important because that's what happened after Chernobyl, a lot of, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when people began to publish on the topic. So I would like to share, I cannot cover, completely the ground of my research, but I will share with you several important points about the two dimensions of KGB disinformation operations in relation to Chernobyl, domestic and international. First, a few words about the domestic dimension of the KGB disinformation campaign. I should praise the courage and efforts of Ukrainian journalists and writers, among them Lyubov Kovalevska, Yuri Sherbak, and Alla Yaroshenska. By the way, the latter was a people's deputy of the USSR from the city of Zhytomyr. I witnessed a very interesting conversation between her and famous Russian poet Evgeny Yevtushenko, who was a frequent guest in Kharkiv because he was elected people's deputy from the city of Kharkiv. So Yaroshenko told him that, when I began to read the documents of the Communist Party, I realized that the deception around the catastrophe turned out to be just as vast as the catastrophe itself. And she said that, I sent to Evgeny Alexandrovich a very detailed report, and I wanted to alert you that we should raise this question at one of our meetings, meetings of the people's deputies. Yevtushenko said, I haven't received anything from you. So when did it happen and how it happened? And I don't know anything about it. And that's just something that suggests that the illustration campaign was already launched by the KGB, and the correspondence from Ukraine was just sort of blocked, in fact. Importantly, on both levels, domestically and internationally, people were kept in the dark about the activities of the Minister of Health. And Yaroshenko, back then, she mentioned thousands of people that were hospitalized already by the 11th of May, where she was talking about the 11 or 12,000 people who were suffering greatly at the Kiev hospitals. So I remember this very important document that was issued on May 11th, 1986. by the Ministry of Health, that of course was controlled by the KGB, and it was order number 24 that prompted doctors to replace the diagnosis of acute radiation syndrome with the diagnosis of VVD, vegetovascular dystonia. So generally speaking, the medical aspect of the Soviet disinformation campaign illuminated with absolute clarity that the inhumane nature of the communist regime is there, should be addressed, and should be publicized. The KGB silenced doctors who concealed the number of deaths caused by the acute radiation syndrome, and they were also muted when Volodymyr Sherbetsky issued a resolution, by the way, inspired by the KGB, about people's re-evacuation to Chernobyl. They were supposed to come back to cover up the extent of the disaster. And actually, this resolution stated that children and pregnant women could be returned to the areas where the radiation levels fell within the limits from 2 to 5 millirentgen per hour. And to personalize this story a little bit, I would say that during this particular time, during after the accident, I gave a birth to a baby girl, and I was pregnant at the time. And when she was born healthy, I was fortunate. But when I heard this sort of information about sort of this option for people that they have to return, I was absolutely sort of surprised, because my first degree is a medical degree. So I knew that the exposure to this level of radiation significantly would increase the chances of developing cancer. Another very interesting aspect of the KGB's special tactics are operations that targeted Soviet Jews, and not very many people are mentioning this or writing about this. The KGB leadership expressed concerns that because of Chernobyl, the number of immigration applications from the Jewish part of Ukraine's population increased, and suggested intensifying ideological measures in the workplace, including academia. So the KGB invited Jews for prophylactic talks in their KGB headquarters. You might imagine that it was just intimidating, of course, for them. And they offered them false statistics that were prepared for them about the extent of the tragedy, and also blaming them for lack of patriotism and attempts to avoid the draft. And by the way, in light of something that we know today, it's a very important piece of information, because the conscription of reservists for decontamination was conducted by deception. And as we know today, in Estonia, for instance, 12 individuals were executed in June 1986 for refusing to take part in decontamination. So now, very briefly, because I don't have much time, let me address several points in regards to the Soviet disinformation campaign designed to confuse the international community. So because of Soviet deception for foreigners, it was extremely difficult to separate facts from disinformation. Thoroughly designed tactics and strategies managed to confuse even the Western, including American intelligence community, that gradually, not at once, but gradually began to learn how Soviet authorities created a cloud of lies after the disaster, and began to work on counterintelligence strategies to mitigate the consequences of Soviet disinformation. And by the way, we have to mention Viktor Chabrikov, who was the head of the KGB of the USSR at the time. He played a key role in mobilizing the KGB and state-run media to prevent the leak of any information about the accident abroad, and moreover, to manufacture false facts about the disaster's course and fatalities. And these initial efforts, I would say, were quite successful. The KGB used three groups of agents of influence to spread disinformation about Chernobyl. First, so-called trusted contacts, foreigners in high position. The second group was controlled agents of influence, foreigners who actually were recruited by the KGB and were typically paid for their services, but not always. And the third group was special contacts, individuals who were located in a country that has had close relations with the USSR, where active recruitment of agents were discouraged for political considerations. And they were not on a payroll, but their relationship with the KGB was reinforced by different sort of gifts and incentives and perks. So their targets were government officials, academia, and journalists. And in reference to Chernobyl, one particularly effective, I would say, Soviet agent of influence against Western journalists was Viktor Lewis. And his task was to leak false information to foreign journalists and to spread disinformation about who said what among Soviet officials or even among Soviet intellectuals such as Andrei Sakharov. The KGB Residentura in the United States received very thorough instructions about countermeasures to neutralize the activities of the Ukrainian diaspora in North America and Ukrainian national centers that tried to circulate truthful information about the accident. So special measures were designed to target also foreign journalists, and they became a real problem for the KGB. The KGB routinely stole, as we know today, soil samples that were collected from the disaster zone, swapping them for non-contaminated samples. And also the KGB created forgeries to distract the international community's attention from Soviet mishandling of Chernobyl and deflect criticism to the United States. The classic example is, of course, the case of Herbert Romerstein, and he was a scholar, a historian, and a writer who was appointed director of the US Information Agency's office to counter Soviet disinformation and active measures. So the KGB used an authentic letter written by Romerstein that he sent to a Czechoslovakian diplomat, and they replaced the original text with a fake text. And basically the message was that Romerstein was saying, okay, let's use Chernobyl disaster as an effective propaganda campaign in the United States. And the main objective, of course, of this operation was to persuade the West that the disaster was not a Soviet phenomenon and the result of sort of Soviet mismanagement, but rather an accident that could happen anywhere. That's the nature of nuclear power, and that was just the message. Very briefly, a couple of words, about the consequences of the Soviet disinformation campaign. Domestically, and I think Serhii already mentioned this to a degree, the state's attempts to conceal the tragedy at the expense of people's health and lives quickly elevated Chernobyl to a political issue. I'm not saying that Chernobyl caused the collapse of the Soviet Union, but Chernobyl became a contributing factor that played a huge role in the final disintegration of the Soviet Union. Internationally, Soviet massive disinformation inspired the Western intelligence community to reconceptualize and enhance their approaches to collecting intel through open sources, human intel, imagery intel. So they became alert to what is happening really in the Soviet Union. And also the CIA realized that in the atomic industry, the Soviets had no safety plans and procedures in place whatsoever. And cleaning up Chernobyl was largely an improvisation. Soviet disinformation encouraged also the countries of Eastern Europe to seek contacts with the West for nuclear energy cooperation, in the areas of nuclear safety and in environmental protection for the first time in the history of Soviet domination in these countries. So to summarize, it's important to understand that it would not be perhaps an exaggeration to suggest that despite the KGB measures designed to camouflage the consequences of Chernobyl, the Western intel community, including the CIA, knew more about the disaster than many Soviet Ukrainians or Belarusians who actually paid for their ignorance with their lives and health. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olga, for your presentation, for your statements, and indeed for the definitions, which are, I think, a cornerstone element of our today's discussion. And to those who have joined us slightly later, or to those who are watching the live stream of this discussion on Facebook, on the Ukrainian Institute's account, and of course on the account of the Permanent Mission of Ukraine to the United Nations. I'm reminding you that we are discussing the origins and the aftermath of Chernobyl tragedy and the lessons to be learned today by the international community, today on the 35th anniversary of this terrible tragedy. And we have with us two distinguished speakers and historians, Serhii Plokhii and Olga Bertelsen, who have just shared their presentations, brief presentations, and we can actually continue into a discussion between our guests, and of course the participants of this event can ask questions, and you can use your Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to type questions or to raise hands if you have any questions and would like to sort of chip into the discussion. And to those who are watching us on Facebook, you can ask your questions in comments to the live streamed events on Facebook, and my colleagues will pass these questions on to us. So to kick off with sort of a first question and reflection to Olga about this whole industry, right? If I may use that word, of disinformation, concealment, and deception and subterfuge employed by the Soviet authorities in the case of Chernobyl. But of course, we understand that it didn't emerge overnight. You mentioned some of the disinformation campaigns that can be dated as back to 1950s. But actually, I would like to ask you a broader question about the whole Soviet project. The Soviet project as a project of as an authoritarian regime, and as we know, authoritarian regime tend to rely on deception, controlled spread of information, and disinformation, and subterfuge, and all the various tools that actually are employed to protect this regime from collapse. Can we, sort of looking back at the Chernobyl tragedy, can you elaborate a little bit more about other cases of targeted disinformation campaigns constructed, employed, and implemented by the Soviet regime throughout the history of the Soviet Union, and the impact of those disinformation campaigns, which may prompt us to better understand the case of Chernobyl and its repercussions of today. Thank you.
Thank you, Volodymyr, for this question. Absolutely, there were a lot of operations, and this, especially after after 1945. We can go back actually, but it is just a very lengthy topic, to the 1920s, to the late 1920s. But if even we think about the Cold War period, the Soviets were extremely actually active, and I would say the objectives and the goals changed, but the strategies and tactics didn't. So the main thing was what? The suppression, deletion, misrepresentation of information that was inconvenient for the Soviets. For instance, recently I published an interesting work that the focus of this work was the operation under the code name Возмездие, retribution or payback. And that was just a very significant sort of operations for the Soviets, because what happened during the Cold War, if you remember, in the late 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s, the anti-Soviet human rights movement in the West took very, very clear contours. And as a result of it, a lot of people of various ethnicities began to participate in this human rights movement. The Jewish diaspora and the Ukrainian diaspora became very, very close. So the task of the Soviets was to sow discord among Jews and Ukrainians. And that was just the objective of this operation Возмездие. And I published, from my perspective, it's an interesting work because it's based about this particular operation. It's published in the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, and it explains actually in detail what was happening. And we can take this particular case as a template, and we might imagine how other operations sort of were conceived and how the Soviets proceeded in this respect. So I invite you to take a look at this piece, especially because it contains new archival documents that I accidentally, by the way, discovered in the former KGB archive in Kiev. So I mean, briefly answering your question, yes, I mean, they were actually, the Soviets were excellent in this respect, especially when we are talking about covert action, covert operations of ideological subversion. And that was just the goal, to subvert foreign nations, to change their perceptions of reality. And I hope to an extent, I answered your question.
Thank you, Olga. Yes, I think it's indeed a big question that it takes a lot of research to answer more fully. But thank you for your response. And I would like to ask Serhii then, basically, despite the unfortunate success of the disinformation campaign domestically and internationally pertaining to the Chernobyl disaster, the message that you put forward quite strongly both in your presentation today, but also in your book about Chernobyl, is that the tragedy triggered, or was at least one of the chief contributing factors to the collapse of the Soviet Union and disintegration of the Soviet Union. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? What was the state of, how in 1990, 1991, the public, the general public in the Soviet Ukraine was, how aware was it of the real scale and aftermath of the tragedy under this, circumstances of disinformation and feeding false information to its own society, but also to the international community? How could have that triggered the collapse of the Soviet Union, the independence referendum that took place in Ukraine, and where actually people could find out the real state of things in the aftermath of Chernobyl? Because between the tragedy and the collapse of the Soviet Union, a mere few years had passed. How could that have contributed to this?
Well, thank you for this question. Yes, the KGB in particular and the Soviet Union in general were trying to control information. They couldn't control the spread of the radiation. And some of the observers talk about Chernobyl in 1986 as the final year of the division of Europe and the year when the Iron Curtain effectively fell. the information about radiation and as a result of that accident got to the West and became public before the Soviet Union made even its first very terse announcement about the accident. And I certainly remember those days living in Ukraine. So a lot of information that we were getting was really coming from the foreign broadcasts, from BBC, Deutsche Welle, Voice of America, and so on and so forth. So the instructions of what to do and that it's better to stay inside were first coming from the foreign governments and not from the government of the country of which we were citizens. So that was a major failure of really control over the information. And that resulted in almost immediate rise of distrust toward the authorities. The credit of faith, so to say, was never high in the Soviet Union, but it went up with election of Gorbachev, a young and energetic leader. And really a few months later, 1 year later, there was a Chernobyl and there was silence. Gorbachev didn't address the nation until 3 weeks after the accident. Never visited the nuclear power plant until 3 years after the accident. So that's basically an example of how the information was mismanaged, and the Soviet public actually felt betrayed. Especially this is true in Ukraine, where you have certainly strong, much stronger than, let's say, in Belarus at that time, the sense of self-identity. And it were the Ukrainian writers in particular. And Professor Bertelsen already mentioned these conversations that were happening among the intellectuals. But again, the writers in particular who created the first organizations that helped to channel that distrust over the authorities, protests, and the desire of people to protect themselves. So the origins of the Ukrainian movement for independence, which is known as Ruch, are really in the anti-nuclear mobilization of 1988, 1989, and 1990. The very first political party that was created in Ukraine, the name was the Green World, was the party that came out of this protest against hiding the information from people. So it's impossible. I absolutely agree with what was said, that the Soviet Union would fall apart and disintegrate, whether there would be Chernobyl or not. Maybe it would happen a little bit later. But on the other hand, it's difficult to imagine or difficult to talk about the way how it happened without bringing in Chernobyl, because Ukraine's vote for independence in December of 1991, that was the final nail in the coffin of the Soviet Union. And that vote would not happen without Ruch, and the history of the Ruch is really very closely linked to Chernobyl.
Thank you, Serhii, so much. Can you actually, name the people who helped the society get access to the truth about Chernobyl? Because we understand then in the society of that time, in a very, under very limited access to information, where freedom of information was impossible actually, to the extent that we know it today. Who were the people? What mediums? What tools people actually used to spread this information and to get the credible information across to the society at large?
The people who were involved in that process, again, those who were most vocal were really writers. So the leader of the organization, the Green World that I just mentioned, Yuri Sherbak, was there collecting evidence about what was happening before Svetlana Alexievich was there. So he published the first collection of this recollections and interviews that he had with the liquidators, with the operators of the station. And At that time, the center of the liberal movement was not, let's say, in Kiev or in Minsk. It was in Moscow. So from what I understand, Sherbak's book was almost smuggled from Ukraine to Moscow to be published there in this youth journal, which was called Unist. So people were looking for different ways to get the word out, either through more liberal outlets in Moscow or to smuggling it to the West. And again, I already mentioned the foreign broadcasts. That was an important, very important factor in this breaking the blockade, the informational blockade that the Soviet Union created around Soviet society. Again, especially this is true certainly for the areas that were affected by Chernobyl. And another key figures, again, the writers like Ivan Drach and Volodymyr Yavorivsky, who just recently passed away. And their writings, again, they were really very interesting in the sense that they reflected the transformation of the societal attitude in general to the nuclear energy, because both Drach and Yavorivsky start as writers who welcome the arrival of nuclear energy to Ukraine. For them, that was a sign of Ukraine really maturing, joining the nuclear club. And they were the first actually to say that, well, we were wrong. We didn't know certain things. It brought destruction. They were major really figures, not just in the anti-nuclear movement, but then in the movement toward Ukrainian independence. Ivan Drach became the leader of Ruch, and Volodymyr Yavorivsky was the first member of the Ukrainian parliament who, in August of 1991, read the declaration of Ukrainian independence. Again, it wasn't penned by him, but he was the first to read it.
Thank you, Serhii. 30 years down the line, we live in entirely different societies. We have instant access to information, and we have a lot more tools at our disposal to share and to inform and to educate ourselves and to spread information. But disinformation remains a threat as it was in the 1986, in the 1950s, probably even a bigger threat for today's global security and, of course, the threat to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Olga, could you reflect a little bit on that? What is the state of this disinformation machine employed by different states, by different countries and different entities across the world that prompts us to think much more about international solidarity in combating that threat?
Thank you, Pana Volodymyr, for this question. This is indeed very important today, very actually, it's timely. I mean, because we have a lot of publications, but still, from my perspective, broader audiences do not know much about the mechanisms, about the strategies, about the perhaps the tactics used by the Russians. And by the way, if we think about massive Russian disinformation campaign that started or escalated, I would say, especially after the Euromaidan, the Ukrainian Revolution of 2013-2014, we have to mention here, in this respect, the sort of extensive funds that were invested in this propaganda machine. And if you remember Russian TV, Russia Today became a powerful propaganda tool in the Russian Federation. It was designed actually to become a global, I would say, competitor of these major international companies. I mean, CNN, BBC, and other famous companies. And the first investment was huge, $70 million. I mean, to support the functioning of this sort of TV station. And we know that by 2011, the budget of this company, Russia Today, was $380 million. So, I mean, this is just a mind-boggling number, and we all understand that not so many people in Eastern Europe can afford this investment. So, in this respect, Russia is ahead of I wouldn't say all of us, but is ahead of many states that can allow themselves to sort of employ this kind of investments. I mean, use this kind of money. And we understand where this money comes from. I mean, oil money, that's for sure. We know that the sanctions worked a little bit, and by 2016, the Russians reduced a little bit this number that they invest in this propaganda machine. It's about maybe $300 million, but still, we're talking about substantial sums that are being invested, and efforts being invested in this propaganda machine. And I have to say, it's very effective. If you also ask me, what is the solution? What should we do? What should the international community do in this respect? Because this is just a very important question. And, according to Intel experts, probably exposure and education are those tools that might help mitigate the effects and the consequences of Russian disinformation campaigns. Exposure meaning, what should we do? We should continue to conduct research. We should involve broader audiences in this conversation. We should publish. We shouldn't stop. So otherwise, again, broader audiences would not know what is happening in terms of international sort of developments in this respect. And, many people, and including scholars, by the way, including observers, identified the Russian Federation as a terrorist state. This sort of definition might be legitimate, of course, but we have to explain in more detail. I mean, what they do, how these disinformation campaigns and other active measures work, so that people know exactly what they are talking about.
Thank you, Olga, for touching base on that very important, I think, element of our today's discussion is what we should do to join forces in solidarity and encountering disinformation collectively, and also countering actually the aftermath and the consequences of the Chernobyl disaster itself. And I actually would like to ask a question to both you, Serhii, and Olga. Serhii, what if we talk about, the collective effort taken by the international community in response to Chernobyl, how did that look for the world? So how did that collaboration and solidarity look in terms of preventive measures, but also, active countermeasures to deal with the disaster and to prevent any such disasters happening in the future?
Chernobyl, in terms of the changing of the information regime about the nuclear industry in the world, played a very positive role, in the sense that today, anyone who deals in international arena with the nuclear energy have this saying, or maybe reference, that Chernobyl in one place is Chernobyl everywhere. So the realization of the fact that the nuclear accident in one country means really the spread of the radiation and the threat to the health, to the well-being, to the social cohesiveness, to the political regime in a country beyond the country where the accident took place became really very obvious. And a number of very positive steps were made after Chernobyl in terms of the preparation and signing of a number of agreements about the early information warning about the accidents. Again, there are issues and questions with the way how those treaties are being implemented and how they're being followed, but certainly that was a major breakthrough. Some of the scholars in particular and legal scholars who look at what happened after the Fukushima accident raise a question that, well, Fukushima was not followed by that kind of major transformation of the informational regime and regime of the controls, and say that, okay, we have to go back. Look at Chernobyl to a degree as a model for doing that. Certainly the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, Chernobyl was a contributing factor to that, but the nuclear industry and safety standards, in particular in the former Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, benefited enormously from the active involvement of the International Atomic Energy Association, something that again started with Chernobyl. The first visit of the president of that association happened in May of 1986 to the Soviet Union. The opening of the industry started, and compliance with the international norms and regimes. This is very important for Ukraine, the country where we have today 15 acting reactors with the average age of 32 years plus, where more than 50% of electricity is being produced at the nuclear plants. So again, Ukraine became a major beneficiary of that dramatic change that was caused by Chernobyl. And I mentioned rather earlier, of course, $2.1 billion construction over the fourth damaged block of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. That is obvious, but even more important, it seems to me, is really the knocking down of that iron curtain that existed between the nuclear energy in places like Ukraine and the rest of the world, and introduction of international standards. And as we look forward into the future, one of the main lessons of Chernobyl for me is that international regime has to be, and international control has to be strengthened. Because Chernobyl shows it's the national government that builds the nuclear power plant, has a sovereign right to do that, gets certainly economic and other benefits from it. But if something goes wrong, it becomes the responsibility of the international community. And that's something that has to be understood from the very beginning and built into the system of the international control that we have today.
Thank you, Serhii, for that very important message. And similarly to technological disasters of that scale, disinformation cannot be countered alone, right? And Olga, you spoke a little bit about that. Could I ask you a brief question about how international cooperation looks today in terms of countering disinformation? Is there enough solidarity internationally? Are there other mechanisms in place that can help states collectively address all the threats linked to disinformation and the manipulation of information? You mentioned a few: exposure and education. But in your opinion, are we doing enough? And is Ukraine as a target, right, for many disinformation efforts done by the Russian Federation? Can we offer anything to the world to help that international action against disinformation today?
Thank you very much, Pana Volodymyr. I think I sort of touched upon this very important issue, but I want to add that we shouldn't shy away from another issue, a very important issue, and it's about ideological subversion or operations of ideological subversion conducted by the Russians among American academia. This is just the sort of the engine of any research, scholars, and they are being targeted today. And this is just a very important issue that we have to think about, to conduct research on this sort of subject and to publish, because it's just something that prevents us from some kind of progress. You know, people attend conferences, people discuss a lot of things, and you can see this certain struggle between those who still subscribe to Soviet narratives. By the way, including the Soviet narrative about Chernobyl, and those who sort of rejected this Soviet narrative. So this is just a very important problem. And by the way, we see that the Russians are quite effective in this front, in this realm, meaning scholarly realm, Western academia. And by the way, there will be a wonderful conference in June in Tartu, and we sort of a group of scholars decided to create a panel on this particular topic. And we can see that the influence is very, very powerful. So the goal of this campaign is to promote a single message which might be, you know, nicely packaged and to a degree intellectualized and might be appealing to many, many scholars. And this particular sort of tool or influence is capable of I would say, of shaping people's sort of worldviews, perceptions, and among them a lot of scholars. And this is a huge problem. You're asking me how today, you know, what about the international community? How can we help? Again, I don't know even if there is another method but exposure. We have to address those questions, and it's not only about American academia. I just gave you one example of this particular problem, because there is still a disagreement in the West about many issues about Ukrainian history. There are battles, there are scholarly battles, and this is just not a very good development because there is no consensus. And the question is why there is no consensus. Maybe it's normal for you know, for scholars to perhaps to have some kind of disagreements, and a variety of opinions, you know, is very good. It's just a good development. However, there are crucial questions that, you know, that might be, should be, from my perspective, should be solved. People have to know more, a little bit, at least more about Ukraine, because I noticed that sometimes the views are a little bit skewed because of Russian propaganda. And many scholars express some kind of a Russocentric view of you know, view about Ukrainian history, and also about Chernobyl, by the way. So, I mean, we have to think about it, and it's just a huge problem. And a person who lives in the West, I am part of this discussions, I am part of these debates, and sometimes it's very frustrating to realize that who helps us sort of who helps us understand. Perhaps it's just our job to publish, to know more, to expose Russian active measures, and that's all we can do at this particular point.
Thank you very much, Pani Olga. We have a few questions from the audience already, but first I would like to pass on the floor to Ambassador Sergiy Kyslytsya. I know that he has questions to both our speakers.
Well, thank you. I have been listening very careful, and the question I would like to ask may not be immediately related to Chernobyl, but what I want to say is now when we are all living through the age of COVID pandemic, I wanted to ask both panelists, have it come to your mind that there are certain parallels in how the world and the world governments reacted to the COVID-19 pandemic and how we managed the information, and what was the role of disinformation and misinformation in the COVID pandemic compared, and obviously for different reasons, because we are living in a different world, to what happened after Chernobyl, and how this tragedy today is used once again for the propaganda purposes by Moscow when we look at the situation with the Sputnik 5 vaccine. Do you think that we learned the lessons from Chernobyl, how to behave with the information? Do you think that the governments, different governments from different camps around the world, are accountable enough to their citizens when it comes to the tragedies or to the challenges of the scale that are comparable to Chernobyl? Thank you.
Please, colleagues who would like to answer that first.
I can start.
Please.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for this question. I have been thinking about it and actually even published a number of articles dealing with that for newspapers, for audience, not academic articles, but I've been thinking about it. There are clear parallels. I would start with the fact that in both cases, when it comes to radiation or when it comes to virus, we are dealing with invisible enemy. And that means that it's very difficult to control it. It also means that it's very easy to manipulate the information, real or create fake information. So this one set of parallels. Another set of parallels are related to the fact that it's the case where, again, something that starts in one country, one nation, being either an accident of some sort or relatively natural development, then spreads across the national borders and threatening the health of the society, the political system on a certain level, and stability of countries all over the world. So in that sense, the parallel between pandemic and Chernobyl radiation is really there. What we see, however, is the response of the international community. That would suggest to me that we unlearned the lessons of Chernobyl. If I already mentioned that after Chernobyl, the reaction was that let's remove the borders. Let's allow the international organizations, including UN-based organizations like International Atomic Energy Association, to get into the places behind the iron curtain, into the places where they couldn't get before. The reaction, for a number of reasons, to a pandemic is actually let's build the iron curtains, let's build the walls. And there were calls and actions coming from a number of countries, in particular from the United States, saying that we're withdrawing support from the World Health Organization. So weakening the international organizations that are there to deal with the international disaster, or disaster that certainly has this international dimension. So there was a lot that the world and the international community in general got wrong with Chernobyl. But there was one thing that it got right, and there was international solidarity, and there was the idea that only coming together we can deal with that kind of disaster. And we lost that. We lost that with the pandemic, partially because closing the borders was perceived to be one of the ways also of stopping the spread of the disease, for good reasons and for bad reasons. But there were also political reasons for that isolation, and they're global. They're associated with the populist wave, with the populist rise of the populist politicians in a number of countries, both in Europe, certainly in the United States is not immune to that by any stretch of imagination, and that political factor also was a contributing one. So we have to change as an international community. We have to change the attitude to what is going on and relearn the lessons of Chernobyl, strengthen international institutions, especially the ones associated with UN.
Thank you, Pane Serhii. Pani Olga, would you like to also respond to that question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for this question. And, you know, I would probably think about another context in which COVID should be discussed, and the current disaster that we have in this respect, because first of all, you're asking why also, among other things, why the reactions of different states are so different. And first of all, we have to remember that despite many, at least 3 that I remember, 3 international laws, we still realize that biological weapons programs are still functioning, including, in China and in the Russian Federation. And there are numerous examples that confirm this particular thesis. So, and of course, the reaction from the Ukrainians and from the Russians or from the Americans, they will be different in terms of social or cultural or political mitigation measures. That's for sure. And because for instance, Ukraine doesn't have this program that is being sort of important and lively today. The Russian Federation does have it. So the reactions will be different because of different goals, different objectives. And we shouldn't forget what had been written by Harvard professor Samuel Huntington. Remember, he published an interesting book, and the title is The Clash of Civilizations. So he's talking about that in the 21st century, the culture and different cultures in different states will be something that might provoke conflicts. So my point is, what is the connection between Huntington's thesis and our current situation? Different ideologies, different cultures, different reactions as a result of it, including, different attitudes toward the pandemics, different sort of structure of institutions. So we have to take all these factors into consideration, but most importantly, different political culture. Different political culture, we see that, for instance, Europe became recently quite leftist, and there is a set of circumstances and that shape the reaction toward COVID, the COVID situation, that's for sure. Because conservatives will react in a certain way, and liberals will react in a sort of way. And I think this is very natural. This is just very logical, and it would be just a surprise from my perspective if we had a unifying sort of response or a similar response that emanates from different places. So we have to think about different cultures, different governments, different ideologies, and different goals, geopolitical goals, and that would be probably sort of an answer to many questions, including your question that you are asking.
Thank you, Pani Olga. We can move actually to the questions from the audience. There are a few questions left on the stream on our Facebook page. And the first is from Ashley Haskins. The World Association of Nuclear Operators was created following the Chernobyl accident to promote information sharing and perform evaluations of nuclear power plants internationally. What are your thoughts on how this organization implements the lessons learned from Chernobyl? I suppose that's a question to Pan Serhii.
Thank you for this question. I'm not really familiar very well with the working of that organization, but I certainly didn't come across any criticism associated with that. So my assumption would be that they're certainly performing the function for which they were created. And I want just to stress that that is one of those, creation of that association is one of these positive steps of really creating networks and institutions through which the not just certain standards of safety or operation of the reactors could be introduced, but also the exchange of the experience between people coming from different countries, from different safety cultures, can be initiated. So that would be my comment on the question, but certainly it encourages me to look further into specifically work of that organization. So thanks for your question.
Thank you, Pane Serhii. There is another comment which I think can be turned into a question on this occasion from Rebecca Harms, also under the Facebook live stream. When Fukushima happened, the nuclear company TEPCO and ministers also tried to cover or downplay the situation. But since TV was broadcasting live and we all saw the reactor in flames, the truth could not be hidden. Probably could you reflect a little bit on that comment and whether, you know, whether we can actually name this situation a disinformation attempt, or how successful was it, and how the international cooperation mechanisms and indeed legal structures established in the aftermath of Chernobyl helped, you know, counter that or avoid that in any way? I think it's a great sort of bridge to have to a more recent nuclear tragedy.
I can start certainly if you're okay with that. Yeah?
Yes, please.
Well, in my original introductory presentation, when I talked about the fact that no company administration or leadership of any country is really eager to share information about issues and problems with that industry or what went wrong there, I had in mind also the leadership of TEPCO. Because on the one hand, indeed, the explosion of those reactors, one after another, happening on TV screen in real life. And from what I understand also that the people who managed the disaster learned about what happened on their territory also from that TV broadcast. So the media was there, part of the not just story, but part of the solution. That being said, the TEPCO was anything but happy to share the details of what was happening at the plant itself. And the major role in informing the public and informing certainly the international community was taken over for one reason or another by the government, by the prime minister, by the prime minister's office and government in general. And there were major tensions between the leadership of TEPCO and the government officials, including Prime Minister Khan at that time, with him coming to their headquarters, demanding certain actions from them, and then being actually criticized for getting too involved in solving of that problem. But again, we see the pattern that certainly is there also with 3 Mile Island accident, where the companies themselves or the institutions that run those places, they're just secretive by nature, either because it comes from the tradition of the atoms for war, or because there are certain consequences for them in terms of their business if they bring too many bad news. Of course, the modus operandi, the ethos in that sense, and how you deal with media and with information has to be changed. And again, in the societies which are not democratic, like the Soviet Union, again, the government could get away with a murder, virtually a murder, which resulted in death of many people, hiding that information, mismanaging it, and providing disinformation. It's much more difficult to achieve in the democratic societies, and especially given the current level of the development of social media. Again, very few things can be hidden today, and that's why certainly what I was thinking about when I was listening to Olga's presentation, that the manipulation of information becomes more and more important as it becomes more and more difficult to hide the fact per se.
Thank you very much, Pane Serhii. We have probably another 10 to 15 minutes left of this event and of the Q&A session. There are no more questions from the audience at the moment, but we actually have online with us Anton Drobovich, who is director of the National Institute of National Remembrance of Ukraine, an organization that also has done a lot to interpret, study, and research a lot of materials that had been classified by the Soviet authorities that are pertaining to the Chernobyl disaster. And there is a particular very recent publication that has published almost 200 previously unpublished documents pertaining to that tragedy. And if Anton is online with us, I may ask him to actually comment on this publication, to present it briefly, very briefly, but also maybe to touch base on what is being done in Ukraine today by different state bodies and organizations to help advance research on Chernobyl and helping us make sense of this tragedy today. Anton, are you with us online?
Yes. First of all, let me pass my gratitude for the opportunity to join this event and to contribute to such an interesting discussion. As mentioned before, thank you, Professor Bertelsen, for this. I would like to show you the 2-volume collection of the Kgb documents that was published by Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance, together with the Sectoral Archive of the Security Service of Ukraine and the Institute of History of Ukraine, that is a part of the National Academy of Science. I really hope that next year we will find the partners and will translate this book into English, so all of the hundreds of these documents will be available for the whole world. And now I take this opportunity for delivering shortly 2 following messages. First of all, the memory about Chernobyl is live, complicated, but healing for the world. It is hard to work with this memory as it is emotional and subjective. However, the witnesses and the participants of those events are still alive, and they help us to draw the lessons of this tragedy. The government of Ukraine, civic organizations, scientists, and enthusiasts are contributing a lot in order to keep this memory in the oral history projects, in documentaries, books, and art exhibitions. And that is what contrasts with the Soviet totalitarianism. That is another front of the democracy where Ukraine, even often lacking the resource for the most necessary, finds the strength for working with this story in order to reconstruct the truth about the events that took place 35 years ago, to call the notions by their names, and to restore the rights of those people who got hurt. This is our contribution to the global access to the truth, but we also remain thankful to those who help us and support us. This is invaluable. And second, I suppose Chernobyl has not to be an exclusion zone in future. Chernobyl has to become a revival and recovery zone. That is a story about our future, the space for opportunities for the scientists from different areas, biology, ecology, sociology, for artists, for engineers, energy specialists, and future urbanists, for example. The bravery of our dreams and the ability to believe in our future will determine what will be this territory in 1 or 2 generations, as well as to large extent whether such a tragedy will happen again in future. If we are looking at the past, we see in the frame of the Soviet Union the link between the nuclear power plant named after Lenin and the disaster, lies, irresponsibility, isolationism, anti-human practices of the totalitarian special service, innocent victims, and fear. And I am happy that Ukraine is working with this complicated legacy, and step by step, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant acquires new connotation. The place of the nature revival, the space for creation, location for advanced engineering creation, platform for cooperation of many nations, innovative tourist destination. It is a complicated process that needs a lot of time, but I suppose we definitely get more chances for success owing to such events as this one. So thank you very much, Ukrainian Institute, for this event. And thank you, Professor Plokhii, and thank you, Professor Bertelsen, for your very interesting views of this problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anton, for your remarks. And among others, I would totally agree about the multitude of connotations that Chernobyl can and should be explored today with. And with that in mind, I would like to ask our final question to our 2 panelists about the current state of play with their research, with their projects that are related to Chernobyl, to study of Chernobyl, and to the lessons learned of that tragedy. So Professor Plokhii and Professor Bertelsen both said that the story of Chernobyl is far from over. We may think that there are thousands or hundreds of books written about this tragedy. There is a great TV series that the world has seen and a lot of people who have first learned about this tragedy from that medium. There are a great deal of research projects and effort done by various professionals in various fields of study, but still the story is not over, is far from over. And I really like that message, and I would like to conclude this discussion with that message. But I would also like to ask our panelists to share some of the projects that you are working on or will be working on in the future that help advance the story of Chernobyl and eventually help, of course, us all to have a better grasp of it, to reflect on it, and to learn from it collectively. So, Pani Olga, would you like to start first?
Thank you. I'm trying now to collect some information about the use of prisoners during the contamination phase of Chernobyl. And we know today that a lot of prisoners were used. Those who were located in prisons, there were about 5 or 6 of them, prisons around this zone, and these people were used in a very brutal way. Most of them didn't survive. And at this particular, and I would like to know and to learn more about this, because very little has been written about this, has been published about this, and probably the knowledge about this particular sort of the use of slave labor, how else we can identify it, would add some kind of a new aspect to this particular tragedy. I have 2 accounts from people who are not with us, no longer with us, they passed away. But they claim that this particular sort of aspect should be explored, this knowledge should be publicized. The task is challenging because of many reasons. First of all, those people who participated in this and who were former prisoners, many of them, the majority of them, are no longer alive. But there are other witnesses who share their memories about what was happening during this contamination sort of period. And we're talking about immediately after the disaster happened. I mean, the accident happened. This is April, May, June. So those dangerous months when people were dying left and right. And another thing that I am trying sort of in a parallel fashion to work on, I'm trying to understand if there are any documents left, meaning archival documents that would sort of uncover another interesting and tragic aspect of Chernobyl, meaning what happened to those people who refused to be drafted. And we have numerous examples, I mean, and we have CIA documents that suggest that people were shot, executed for refusing to participate in decontamination of Chernobyl. This is another aspect that bothers me, and I would like to understand how it happened. I would like to understand the legal implications. I would like to understand who actually sort of gave this order. And it would be just, should we blame the KGB? Should we blame the Communist Party? But it's not about blame. It's about sort of, there is a humanity rationale behind this research. And I think we would like to sort of to go further and to understand better what was happening in this respect with Chernobyl. Thank you.
Thank you, Pani Olga. Pan Serhii, over to you.
Well, I want to thank the Institute of National Memory for doing really very important job with the publication of that 2-volume collection. Kgb documents are extremely important for the story of Chernobyl, as was already demonstrated by Olga's presentation. And on the one hand, the KGB was the institution that was in charge of enforcing the safety measures at the nuclear power plants. And on the other hand, that was the institution that was in charge of keeping the information away from people and assuring that some important pieces of information would not get to operators or to the people affected by the accident. So it's extremely important collection of documents, and I used it I used KGB materials in my own research in the book that I published, and certainly as I move ahead, I am going to take advantage of that publication as well. In terms of moving ahead, I would like to invite everybody to the presentation of the new module of the MAPA Digital Atlas of Ukraine. This is a project of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. The event that I am inviting you to will take place on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday at 12 o'clock. And that will be a presentation of the Chernobyl module. So what we are trying to do there is to put on the map not just the numerous exclusion zone and other zones. There are altogether 4 zones associated with Chernobyl, but also look at the way of how the territory of Ukraine was polluted, what happened to the population, in terms of movement of the population, in terms of the rates of the different diseases, including thyroid cancer in particular, and ask new research questions. So we are really launching, in relation to that anniversary, a major project that we will be working on for a number of years. So I certainly hope that we will come as a result of that, not only with new questions, but also with new and important answers.
Thank you very much, Pane Serhii. Thank you very much to our panelists. We are concluding our today's discussion with these reflections on what has to be done to further study the case of Chernobyl, to learn lessons, to improve international collaboration efforts and international solidarity to combat contemporary cases and campaigns of disinformation, but also international efforts to and legal structures to counter similar nuclear tragedies and technological catastrophes and their prevention. Let me remind you that this discussion was organized by the Ukrainian Institute, the permanent mission of Ukraine to the United Nations, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Today, on the day of the 35th anniversary of Chernobyl disaster. I would like to thank again all the panelists, Ambassador Sergiy Kyslytsya, for hosting this and for contributing to this event and helping us organize it, and of course to all the attendees and the audience that listened to us today. Thanks a lot and have a great day or evening.
Thank you very much.